the Elephant, Part 2. When Dumbo made friends with Tim the Mouse, it seemed his sad and lonely days at the circus were over. He was still a figure of fun because of his big ears. The other elephants refused to speak to him. And worst of all, his mother had been taken away and locked up in a cage in solitary confinement. But somehow life didn't seem quite so bad now that Dumbo had a good friend by his side. "Do you know," Tim told him, "your big ears could turn out to be your fortune in the end." Dumbo flapped his ears and blinked. "Oh, I don't think so," he said shyly. "People just laugh at them and they call me a freak." "We'll make them eat their words. You just wait and see," Tim said confidently. "Lots of people with big ears are famous. I'm going to make you a star, Dumbo. In fact, I have an idea." With that, the tiny mouse raced off, leaving the surprised elephant standing there in a daze. Tim crept into a tent where the ringmaster lay fast asleep. "I am the voice of your dreams," the mouse whispered into his ear. "And I'm going to give you an idea for the greatest circus act ever performed. Now listen carefully." The ringmaster stirred and grunted in his sleep. "A pyramid of elephants," Tim went on. "Imagine a pyramid of elephants. Then the star appears, the little elephant called Dumbo, with the big ears. He runs onto the stage, jumps on a springboard, soars through the air, and lands right on top of the pyramid. Just remember, the little elephant with the big ears." As if by magic, the ringmaster woke up the next morning with the most wonderful idea he'd ever had. Excitedly, he called for his assistant Joe and told him about the pyramid of elephants. That's wonderful, sir. I mean, it's fantastic," said Joe, who never liked to disagree with his boss. "How did you think of such a brilliant idea?" "Well, it just sort of came to me in a dream," said the puzzled ringmaster. But when the time came to perform the great act, Dumbo was very nervous indeed. The lady elephants had climbed on top of each other to form a huge pyramid in the centre of the ring, and now the crowds waited impatiently for the star of the show. Dumbo stood at the side of the tent, hardly daring to move. "Go on, Dumbo," coaxed Tim. "You can do it. I know you can." But I can't," quaked the terrified elephant. "Of course you can. You've got to. You're the star," said Tim urgently, giving him a push. It was instant disaster. Dumbo leapt onto the springboard, but instead of landing on top of the pyramid, he smashed into the side of it, sending all the elephants crashing down. The audience screamed, the ringmaster shouted furiously, and the elephants shrieked and groaned as they tumbled and bounced onto the ground. Dumbo was in absolute disgrace. The lady elephants would never forgive him for what he had done, and when the circus moved on to the next town, they sat in the train with crutches, bandages, black eyes and bruises. "Ouch, my tail," moaned Giggles. "Oh, my leg," groaned Prissy. "I knew that little freak would cause nothing but trouble for us," said Matriarch angrily. "I'd like to put him across my knee and give him a good hiding." "I shouldn't worry about him," sneered Catty. "They've given him his punishment all right. In fact, it's such a disgrace, I can hardly bear to tell you." "Tell us at once, out with it," snapped Matriarch. "Well," said Catty in a horrified whisper, "they've made him a clown." "Oh, What? Seethed Matriarch. A clown, repeated Catty. A clown? Oh, no, a clown. Giggles laughed hysterically. Oh, a clown! The shame of it, gasped Prissy. Well, my dears, began Matriarch in shocked tones, this is the final disgrace. Dumbo is no longer worthy of being called an elephant. We must take a vow to disown him once and for all. When the circus had been set up in the next town, the unhappy Dumbo was dressed up in a frilly cap and bib for his act with the clowns. They made him stand on top of a burning tower, waving a rattle, and he had never felt so ashamed in all his life. In fact, he was such a ridiculous sight that the audience burst out laughing as soon as they saw him. The clowns rode into the ring in a fire engine and put a ladder up against the tower. One by one, they ran up the ladder and threw buckets of water in Dumbo's face. The audience gasped as the flames spread higher and higher up the tower towards Dumbo. And just when they thought the little elephant was going to be burnt in the fire, he had to jump all the way down and land plonk in the middle of a tub of wet plaster. He emerged a sorry and sticky sight, rubbing the white plaster from his eyes and shaking it out of his enormous ears. The audience clapped and roared with laughter. Even the clowns pointed at him and laughed, and the lady elephants laughed louder and longer than anyone. "Doesn't it just serve him right?" said Catty. "Oh dear," shrieked Giggles. "I thought I would die laughing." Poor Dumbo felt so humiliated, he just crept away and sat by the tent and cried. Soon Tim scurried up to him with a bowl of water, some soap and a scrubbing brush, and began to wash the plaster from Dumbo's face. "Don't cry, Dumbo," said the little mouse kindly. "You were a success. The audience loved it." Teardrops kept on rolling down Dumbo's face. He knew Tim was only trying to make him feel better, but it was no good. He was just a figure of fun in the circus, that's all. A hopeless clown. "Oh, come on, Dumbo. It isn't nearly as bad as all that," coaxed Tim. "Cheer up. You'll be a real star one day. I know you will. Anyway," he went on brightly, "I've made a very special appointment for you today, Dumbo. We're going to visit your mother." The little elephant stopped crying immediately and followed Tim past the circus tents to a wagon all on its own at the far side of the field. Metal bars had been hammered across the window, and a big notice said, "Danger, Mad Elephant." Tim raced ahead calling out, "Mrs. Jumbo! Mrs. Jumbo! There's someone to see you!" There was a sound of clanking metal as Mrs. Jumbo came forward, but she was chained to the wall and couldn't reach the window. So she put her trunk through the bars as Dumbo bounced up. "It's me!" he cried out excitedly. "It's me, Dumbo!" "Oh, my precious baby!" exclaimed Mrs. Jumbo, and the two elephants entwined their trunks and nuzzled each other. "Don't cry," said Mrs. Jumbo soothingly. "Dry your eyes and be happy again." But I miss you so much," Dumbo stammered. "And I miss you too, Dumbo," she told him. "But even though we're parted, you're always close to my heart." It was such a touching sight that Tim's eyes were quite misty. It was obvious to him that Mrs. Jumbo wasn't mad. It was hardly fair to lock her up in a cage just because she'd lost her temper when some boys were cruel to Dumbo. After all, she'd done what any mother would do, try to protect her baby. The more Tim thought about it, the more unfair it seemed, and he felt determined to do something about it. Of course, he was only a little mouse without much influence in the world, but he was sure that somehow he could find a way to bring Dumbo and his mother together again.
does some Roo-Sitting. Kanga didn't often go out without Roo, but this was one of those days when she just had to. "No, dear, you can't come with me," she told him, as she put him into a clean T-shirt. "But Pooh's coming to spend the day with you." "Oh, goody!" Roo said, and he jumped up and down in excitement. "Now, Roo, dear," Kanga said sternly, "you must behave yourself with Pooh." I will, Roo shouted enthusiastically. Then there was a knock on the door. "Hello, Kanga. Hello, Roo," Pooh said as he came in. "And how are you, little fellow?" "Hello, Pooh," Roo said excitedly. "Hello." "Now do behave yourself, dear," Kanga told him as she tied her headscarf under her chin. "I've left a little something for you in the cupboard," she said to Pooh as she left. "Well," said Roo as soon as she'd gone, "what shall we do now?" But Pooh had that glazed look on his face, which meant that it was 11 o'clock-ish, even if it wasn't. And there was nothing else for it but to wander over to the cupboard just to have a little look, just in case, by chance, Kanga had left some honey. And sure enough, in front of the pots of extract of malt and the tins of condensed milk, there was a little jar of honey marked, "For Pooh." "But I want to go and play," Roo complained. And every time Pooh tried to dip his paw into the jar, Roo tugged at his arm, until finally Pooh growled, "All right, we'll go to the sandy place and you can practice your jumps and fall down mouse holes and climb out of them again, and I'll just sit and watch and maybe have a little taste of honey now and then." "Oh, can we? Can we?" said Roo, who always knew it would be fun having Pooh looking after him. And so out they went to the sandy place, Roo running here and there and pretending to get lost, and Pooh walking hurriedly along with his jar, thinking very hard about his honey and taking no notice at all of Roo. At the sandy pit, Pooh sat down and was just dipping his tongue into the lovely thick honey when Roo thought up a new game which he called Burying Pooh in the Sand. Now, Roo... Pooh started, but he soon learnt that opening his mouth during this game wasn't very wise. When his legs had completely disappeared, and he still hadn't had his little something, he said, "I know. Let's go down to the bridge and play a game I invented called Pooh Sticks." "Oh, can we? Can we?" Roo shouted, even more excited than before, and they both went down to the bridge over the river. "Now," said Pooh, "pay attention, little fellow, and I'll show you what to do." And picking up 2 sticks, he placed one in Roo's paw and held the other in his own. And when he shouted, "Now!" they both dropped them into the water over one side of the bridge and rushed to the other side to see whose stick appeared first. "I'm winning! That one's mine!" said Roo. And Pooh, who had other things on his mind, said, "That's right, little Roo. Now, you throw the sticks over that side, and I'll just sit down here and judge whether you've won or not." "All right," said Roo brightly. So Pooh sat with his legs dangling over the side of the bridge, dipped his tongue into the honey, and took it out to shout, "You've won!" and then put it back in again. Then took it out once more, shouting, "You've won again!" And he was just about to do this a third time when there was a little squeal of "Help! Help!" behind him. Pooh jumped up and ran across the bridge, shouting, "Roo! Roo!" And there was a loud splashing noise. "Where are you?" Pooh called. But Roo wasn't there. "Oh, help!" cried Pooh. "He's fallen in." And he saw in the distance, a little way downstream, something bobbing up and down in the water. But then it disappeared. "Oh, Roo!" Pooh cried sorrowfully, and he raced off the bridge and along the bank to look in the water. But there was no sign of him. Roo, who was hiding under the bridge all the time, had waited until Pooh got up to search for him. Then he had knocked the jar of honey into the water before hiding again to see what would happen. "He must have drowned," Pooh whispered, and little tears appeared in the corner of his eyes and ran down his furry face. Then he turned quickly and ran as fast as he could, which wasn't very fast at all due to his stoutness, back to Kanga's house. "How can I tell her?" he said dolefully. What can I say? And then, with real sadness, he said, I'll never eat honey again. Soon, Roo crept out of his hiding place and went bouncing off home to see what would happen next. When Kanga arrived back, Pooh was sitting alone in her kitchen. Oh, Kanga, he said, something terrible has happened. And he told her all about playing Pooh sticks and how, when his back was turned, Roo had fallen in. Kanga was much too upset to say anything at first. She turned around and, wiping her tears away with her apron, she went into Roo's room. As she stood in the doorway, sighing heavily, saying, Oh, Roo, several times over, Roo jumped out of the corner he'd been hiding in and shouted, Surprise! Surprise! Roo, Kanga said sternly, how could you? But she was much too happy to be angry, and she hugged and kissed him and went into the kitchen to make him his favourite lunch. When Pooh heard what had happened, he was too upset at the drowning of his jar of honey to be completely happy, but he recovered little by little as Kanga fed him with honey sandwiches until he was full enough and sleepy enough to feel more kindly towards Roo once again.
Toad, the Bargain Hunter. Mr. Toad was driving through the town at great speed, as usual, when his eye was caught by a grand sale sign in a shop window. Toad, who was a great believer in bargain hunting, screeched to a halt and leapt out of his car. He hurried into the shop and was delighted to find it full of bright summer clothes, short-sleeved shirts, summer suits, swimming trunks, and sun hats, all reduced to half price. The only trouble was that summer was almost over, and the days were starting to get a bit chilly. But Toad wasn't going to miss a bargain.
I'll have 2 suits, 3 shirts, 2 pairs of swimming trunks, a sun hat, and 2 pairs of those sandals as well,
he said, spotting a pile of leather sandals in the corner. Toad paid for his bargains, then, laden with carrier bags, he staggered to his car. Chuckling gleefully, he drove at breakneck speed back to Toad Hall. Ratty and Mole were waiting in the living room, warming their hands in front of a glowing fire. Proudly, Toad showed them his purchases.
But, Toad, said Ratty, these things are no use to you now. It's too cold to wear them.
You'd better put them safely away until next summer, Mole advised him.
Put them away? Exclaimed Toad. Nonsense! I'm going to wear them now. Now, don't be silly, Toad, said Ratty. You'll catch your death of cold. Not where I'm going, said Toad gaily, leaping back into the car and taking his bargains with him. I'm off to the airport to catch a plane somewhere hot and sunny, so I can wear them. You don't get bargains like these every day.
But, Toad, said Mole despairingly, if you spend a lot of money on an expensive holiday just to wear your clothes, then they're not bargains at all. Don't you see?
What was that, old chap?
Asked Toad, as his car engine roared into life.
Can't hear a thing. See you in a few weeks.
Toad waved cheerfully as the car sped into the distance, leaving Ratty and Mole shaking their heads at his foolishness.
Micky and Donald go fishing. Whenever the sun shone on summer weekends, Mickey Mouse packed up his fishing gear and went to call on Minnie. "Will you come fishing today, Minnie?" he asked. But the answer was always the same. "Oh, no thanks," Minnie said. "Fishing is so boring." A little later, Donald Duck, clutching his fishing rod, knocked on Daisy's door. "I'm going fishing," he said to her. "Do you want to come along?" "No, thank you," said Daisy. "I've got better things to do today." So Donald set off down the river, and there he found Micky already fishing from the opposite bank. "Hello there," he called. "Isn't Minnie with you?" "No," replied Micky. "She doesn't really like fishing." "Daisy feels just the same way," said Donald, as he settled down with his rod. Some time passed before Micky's float started to bob up and down. He jumped up in excitement and quickly reeled in his line, but the fish he'd caught was so tiny he decided to throw it back. A little while later, Donald hooked something as well. He strained hard on his rod to pull it in, but before very long he realized that all he'd caught was a big clump of weed. The sun was already high in the sky, and Donald and Micky started to feel hungry. They unpacked their sandwiches and sat there happily munching while their lines drifted in the stream. Suddenly, both the lines jerked violently, and Donald and Micky leapt to their feet. "I've got a bite!" they shouted at the same time, reeling in their lines in panic. "Oh, my goodness!" gasped Micky. "It must be a huge fish. It's fighting hard." "Mine too!" Donald panted as he struggled to land his catch. But neither of them realized they had both hooked the same thing, and it wasn't a fish. When Micky pulled hard, Donald thought his fish was struggling, so he pulled as well, nearly overbalancing Micky. They were so busy tugging and pulling that they didn't notice a punt approaching. Daisy was reclining in the bows opposite Minnie, while Donald's rival, Gladstone Gander, punted them slowly along. "Good afternoon, Donald. Having fun?" asked Daisy sweetly. Donald started to splutter with rage, but just then Micky gave an extra hard tug at his fishing rod. The tangled lines rose to the surface, and for the first time the two fishermen realized what had happened. Not only were their fishing lines attached to each other, but they'd both hooked the same catch, a large rubber tire. At that moment, the punt steered straight into the lines, and both Micky and Donald nose-dived into the river with an enormous splash. The punt sailed serenely into the distance, with Daisy and Minnie giggling on board. "Bye," they waved. "Hope you catch some fish." Micky and Donald floundered around in the river until they managed to reach the bank and scramble out. Then they sat shivering on the bank, wringing out their wet clothes. Suddenly Micky brightened up. "I know where we can get some fish," he said. And 5 minutes later they were sitting on the waterfront, watching the boats go by and eating the biggest portions of fish and chips they could buy.
Princess Aurora and the Evil Fairy's Spell. There once lived a king and a queen who were good and kind and had everything they could wish for, except for a child of their own. They wanted a child more than anything in the world, but as the years passed, they gradually lost hope of ever having a baby. So you can imagine their great happiness when one day it was announced that at last the Queen was expecting a child. The following spring, bells throughout the kingdom rang out joyfully. The Queen had given birth to a beautiful baby girl. The palace hummed with excitement, and invitations were sent out far and wide for the christening of little Princess Aurora. Soon the great day arrived, and as the guests assembled, triumphant fanfares echoed through the palace hall. The infant was to be blessed by 3 fairy godmothers, Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather.
There was silence in the crowded hall as first Flora and then Fauna waved their wands and bestowed their gifts on the little princess. But just as Merryweather raised her wand, a deafening crash of thunder shook the palace, and a harsh cackle rang out in the hushed hall. It was the wicked fairy Maleficent. She alone had not been invited to the christening, and now she was determined to take revenge.
"You thought you could forget me," she screeched. "But now I shall make you a promise you'll never forget. Before the last hour of her 16th birthday, your precious princess will prick her finger on a spindle and fall down dead."
And with a vicious shriek of laughter, the dreadful Maleficent vanished in a cloud of smoke and flames. The Queen sobbed in despair and clutched her baby to her, but then Merryweather stepped forward. She had not yet given her gift to baby Aurora, and although she could not remove the spell completely, she could make sure that Aurora would not die. The princess will prick her finger, but instead of dying she will fall into a sleep that will last 100 years. But the spell may be broken if a man who truly loves her wakes her with a kiss. Merryweather's words gave some comfort to the King and Queen, but they were still sick at heart, for they knew Maleficent had great power and wished only evil for the princess. If only there was a way to protect their daughter from the spell. In the end, it was the 3 fairies who thought of a plan to deceive the evil witch. They would disguise themselves as peasants and take the baby princess with them into a remote part of the forest. There they would look after her until her 16th birthday, when she would return to the palace. With tears in their eyes, the King and Queen kissed their little daughter goodbye. Sadly, they watched from a balcony until the fairies and their tiny charge reached the edge of the forest and disappeared into the gloom of the night. Flora, Fauna and Merryweather made their home in an old woodcutter's cottage, and there they cared for Briar Rose, as they called the princess.
"Now," said Flora, "we simply have to learn to get along without our magic."
"What?" piped up Fauna. "What about all the cooking and cleaning? We always do that with magic."
"No buts. We'll lock away those wands. If Maleficent's spies see any sign of magic, she'll know exactly where to find us."
As the years passed, Briar Rose grew up happily with her 3 kind aunts, until at last her 16th birthday arrived. The fairies were in a flurry of excitement, because tonight Briar Rose would at last find out she was a royal princess.
"It's all so thrilling," said Merryweather, as they whispered together in a corner. "They've invited everyone to a ball at the palace to welcome her back. And Hubert's son, Prince Philip, is to come and ask for her hand in marriage. He really is everything a girl could wish for."
Briar Rose was quite mystified at her aunt's excitement.
"Off you go and pick some fruit, dear. We've got important work to do," said Flora, hustling her away.
Picking up her basket, Briar Rose ran into the forest to gather the wild raspberries that grew there. Then, singing a little song to herself, she sat down in a grassy glade. It so happened that Briar Rose was not alone in the forest that morning, and she looked up, startled, as someone else stepped into the glade. It was a tall, young man, dressed for hunting. "I didn't mean to frighten you," he said hesitantly. "I heard your singing, and I just had to come and see who you were."
Briar Rose smiled. He was the most handsome young man she had ever seen.
They talked and laughed together, and the time seemed to fly by. As the hours passed, they both knew they had fallen completely in love. Briar Rose was suddenly anxious to get back. She had been away so long her aunts would be worried about her. "But when shall I see you again?" cried the young prince.
"Come to the cottage this evening," whispered Briar Rose as she left.
In fact, her aunts had been far too busy to worry. Their plan to make a beautiful gown for the princess was not going well. All they had managed to produce so far was something looking more like a shapeless sack. Cross and irritable, they decided there was only one thing to do. Breaking the promise they made 16 years before, they unlocked their dusty wands and, with a magic spell, created the dress of their dreams. But they could not decide on the colour, and amidst all their squabbling and waving of wands, with the dress changing colour every second, they didn't notice the sparks of magic flying up the chimney and into the forest. It was a terrible mistake, for just then an evil crow, a servant of Maleficent, flew across the cottage right into the path of the magic sparks. He flew straight off to tell Maleficent, who knew at once where the fairies had been guarding the princess. The secret was out, and in the very last hours of the spell. When Briar-Rose arrived back, the 3 fairies proudly showed her the gown. Briar-Rose was delighted. "Oh, I'll wear it tonight," she cried, and told her aunts about the handsome stranger. "Oh, my dear," said Flora, "I think you must forget this young man." The surprise could wait no longer. They told Briar-Rose the story of her royal birth and the evil spell. "And the most exciting thing," continued Flora, "is that Prince Philip will be at the ball. You are to be betrothed. It's all arranged." But Briar-Rose was quite dismayed. "I've told you I love someone else, and I can't bear the thought of never seeing him again." And she began to sob bitterly. In spite of her tears, the good fairies knew they must keep their promise to the King and Queen. Briar-Rose set off with them to the palace, and there she waited alone for the reunion with her parents. But Maleficent had other plans. Suddenly the fire in the hearth spluttered and died, and in its place a steep staircase appeared. Spellbound, Aurora climbed the narrow steps and found herself in a tiny turret. There stood a spinning wheel, and beside it the wicked fairy.
"Pick up the spindle,"
Maleficent commanded. Aurora was powerless to resist. At once she pricked her finger and fell to the ground as if dead. Cackled Maleficent triumphantly as she swept away into the night. It was the 3 fairies who discovered the sleeping princess. Whatever could they do? The King and Queen would be distraught with grief. "If only we had more time. We can break the spell, you know. We have to find that young man Aurora has fallen in love with. Remember, her true love can wake her with a kiss." In a trice the fairies acted. "We'll put the whole palace to sleep until this spell is broken." Over the palace they flew, sprinkling a magic sleeping powder until everyone, even the cats and dogs, lay in a deep slumber. But as the fairies made their way through this strange scene, they saw old King Hubert tossing and turning in his sleep.
"Humph," he muttered. "Well, I won't stand for it. My son Philip in love with a peasant girl? Briar-Rose, indeed."
The fairies stood stock still. They could hardly believe their ears. So Briar-Rose's handsome stranger was none other than the prince, and he could waken her with a kiss. Quickly they flew off to the forest to find Prince Philip. In their hearts they knew now that all would be well, for their dear Briar-Rose would awaken to find herself a very happy princess, with the prince of her dreams by her side.
Jack Sprat. Jack Sprat could eat no fat, his wife could eat no lean, and so between them both, you see, they licked the platter clean.